Hi, Professor Monroe again. Welcome back. And in this video, we're going to talk about the relationship of reason to ethics in Immanuel Kant's deontology and the concept of autonomy. The two are closely related, so we'll talk about them together. It's worth noting that most ethical theorists talk about reason and its role in ethical decision-making. For example, Aristotle talks about using our reason to find the mean between two vices, one of having too much of a virtue and one of having too little. It helps us find the balance in between. And the utilitarians use a kind of inductive, predictive model to try to do a cost-benefit analysis. Now, Immanuel Kant takes a fundamentally different approach to the role of reason in ethics, in that he sees that reason is largely deductive. And in this sense, Kant indeed argues that what's moral to do just is what's rational to do. That is, moral reasoning is just deductive logical reasoning in the context of conduct. He calls this pure practical reason. It's an important move for Kant because Kant does not want to tie ethics to human nature in the way that most of our ethical theories have. For example, Aristotle ties it to human nature in the sense of our rationality. The natural law and natural rights theory tightly connect ethics to human nature, but Kant doesn't see it that way. He thinks that it's possible that human beings are not the only rational beings in the universe. And now, in the 21st century, we can see this as sort of sci-fi examples and come up with all kinds of things. But in Kant's day, he was forward-thinking enough to recognize, hey, maybe human beings aren't the only thinking things. And if there is going to be morality at all, it ought to apply not just to human beings, but it ought to apply to all rational beings. So any being that can use logic is capable of a kind of moral reasoning. And if it's capable, any being that's rational and capable of a kind of moral reasoning can do it, then we can expect all rational beings to live up to the same basic standards. So I imagine that Kant had something in mind like angels and demons and the gods in the heavens, but we could think, hey, if we ever did discover life on another planet, is it capable of using the same logical thought processes that we are? Well, if so, wouldn't it be fair to expect them to come up with the same moral standards if indeed Kant is right that moral reasoning just is a kind of logical reasoning? Consider, we wouldn't expect an alien species to have a different kind of mathematics, right? If you were talking to a Klingon from Star Trek and you asked them the question, what is one thing and one thing sum, what does it add up to? The answer would be 2, whether you're a Klingon or whether you're a human being on Earth. And so in that way, Kant conceives of ethical rules as applying not just to human beings, but because they're dictates of pure reason, as applying to anything that's rational. So any thinking thing will come up with the same basic moral conclusions in the same way that we have a kind of universal mathematics. Logic has that same characteristic of applying much more generally. So good, according to Kant, is living according to what reason dictates, and evil is therefore a kind of fundamental irrationality. Now, tying into that this notion of autonomy, which from the ancient Greek means something like self-governing or self-ruling, Kant believes that as rational beings, human beings can deduce the moral law for ourselves, meaning it's capable of discovery for any of us who are rational. All we have to do is sit down and think hard enough and use our logic clearly enough, and we'll come up with the right kind of answer. Now, we shouldn't mistake this notion of autonomy, of being self-governing or self-ruling, with thinking that we make it up as we go. Kant doesn't believe that moral principles are invented by pure reason. He believes that they're discovered by pure reason. In the same way that Euclid didn't invent geometry by sitting down and doing his deductions, he discovered the axioms of his geometry by simply sitting down and reasoning them out. Kant believes that human beings, and indeed all rational beings, are capable of that kind of thing, and that's what it means to say that we're self-governing or self-ruling. Now, since we have that intellectual freedom and the rational power to do so, Kant argues that we must all come to conclusions about morality for ourselves. Now, there's a very important reason why he thinks this, and it hangs on the notion of responsibility. To some extent, if you do the right thing, even if it happens to be the right thing, just because someone else tells you that's the right thing to do, isn't in some sense the fact that you did the right thing dependent on the fact that someone else told you to do so? In a way, you're not responsible for following the moral rules when it's someone else's conclusion that what you're doing is the right thing. So if your parents say, don't beat up your little sister because it's wrong, and you don't beat up your little sister because your parents told you it's wrong, there's a kind of disingenuousness or fakeness about that. That you've come to that conclusion not of your own rational capacities, but as your parents. So there's a disconnect between doing the right thing and your having thought it through on your own. And so for that reason, the reason we want you to be fully responsible, you must reason out the dictates of morality for yourself. Another example to help clarify this point. Consider that in your math classes, sometimes your professors won't allow you to use calculators to come to the answer. Now you know that that calculator might give you absolutely reliable answers. You can know with absolute precision that if you do everything right, you put in the right formulae, that you'll get the right answer. But that's different from an answer that you come to on your own. Right? In a really important sense, if you understand the process whereby you came to an answer, that you've thought it through on your own and done the calculations by hand, we can say, yes, you really much more fully understand how you got there than if you just used the calculator. It's that kind of authenticity, I think, that Kant is getting at by demanding that we figure out morality's rules for ourselves. Notice that this is a very anti-authoritarian view. Not in the sense that he's trying to buck political authorities, but in the sense that we should not rely on authorities to tell us what right and wrong consist in. Since we have the reason to figure it out on our own, we have the obligation to do that, and that's part of what makes us special and unique as rational beings. In the next video, we'll talk about another important concept in Kant's thought, and that's the idea of the good will, or as he says, the only thing that's good without qualification.